30 yards from the pump, a man lay in the dust with an arrow snapped in his shoulder, and the sun beat him flat. A small blanket moved across the ground like a slow animal, and a little girl pushed it with both hands until it covered his ribs. The blanket was red wool with 2 thin black bands and a torn edge. The girl's breath shook, and the warrior's eyes were open but far away. 7 townspeople watched without blinking. 2 rifles leaned against the rail, and 1 tin star caught noon light like a knife. Mason Hale stepped out from the blacksmith doorway with a hammer still warm in his palm. He smelled iron and horse and a kind of fear that had weight. He said easy. The word was for the girl and for the men with rifles, and for whatever else listened. He knelt. He broke the arrow short and pressed the blanket down to stop the blood without lifting it. The girl whispered, "He fell by our fence. Ma said don't touch, but he looked like Pa after the winter cough." Mason said, "You did right. Hold the corner." The girl's fingers were white on wool, and her eyes were fixed on the warrior's throat to see it still move. Marshal Alton Reeves came from the telegraph porch with a clean vest and the habit of making simple things obey. He counted bodies with a glance and chose the loudest one. He said, "Step away, Smith. That man is Comanche, and the law says deliver him. The town will hang if you keep him." He named a price like it tasted sweet, $50 fine and custody to the fort by sundown, or I confiscate your tools and your horse. He smiled without teeth, and the rifles shifted like they wanted to agree. Mason said the fort can have him after a doctor has a look. The marshal said, "You think you are the doctor today?" He raised 2 fingers, and the deputy thumbed back a hammer. Mason lifted both hands and made a decision. No good neighbor would call smart. He set his hammer in the dust like a coin on a church plate and laid 3 10s and a 20 on the rail. He said, "I pay the fine now, and I take the man to my barn for an hour. After that you can chase me for the rest." The girl said, "Mister, please don't let them take his blanket." Her voice made the rifles heavy. Reeves tilted his head and listened for something only he heard. Then he nodded once like a man tolerating a child. He said, 1 hour, 1 deputy with you. If he runs, it comes out of your hide." Mason spoke low to the warrior. "You hear me breathe and move when I lift?" The warrior blinked once. His mouth was dust black. Mason slid arms under shoulders and hips, and the blanket held. The girl kept a corner like it was a rope to safety. They carried across 20 paces of ground that felt like 20 miles of judgment. The deputy walked behind with a rifle muzzle down and a jaw set to crack. They crossed into the shade of the smithy, lean-to, and the air cooled 1 degree. Sound changed, and so did the day. Ella Rye, the girl's mother, came fast with a pistol tucked in her apron, and a look that said she had outlived worse talk than this. She saw her child's hands inside red wool and did not scold. She said, "Mason Hale, if you put that man on my table, I will boil water and keep the kettle hot until your arms give out. And if the marshal complains, I will ask him where he keeps his mercy." Her hair was pinned up like a plan, and her eyes could hold a room. She and Mason were the 2 adults. The wind trusted first. The rest were weather. The deputy grunted and took the door frame like a post that remembered being a tree. Mason cut the arrow head free with a farrier's knife and worked the shaft back smooth. The warrior's jaw locked and then did not. A thin sound left him and went nowhere. Mason packed the wound with clean lint ripped from a flour sack. He tied it down with the edge of the blanket because there was nothing else, and because sometimes a thing already full of meaning can carry more. The warrior watched him with one eye that was too clear for pain. This near noon, the deputy said, "Hurry your charity. The marshal's hour is a strong rope." He tapped the door frame and counted the taps like seconds. Outside the smithy, a shape moved on the ridge. Then another, then 10. Small on the blue line like birds that decided to be horses. The deputy saw them and forgot to look like he was not afraid. He said, "Riders north by the old shale cut, shadows say many." Mason did not turn his head. He kept his hands steady and said, "If they came for blood, we would be blind already." The deputy spat and missed. Ella said, "My child gave a blanket. Maybe someone will give a decision." The warrior swallowed a mouth of air like water and found a word. He said, "Naya." It sounded like a wind through brush, and the deputy flinched like his name had been called by something he owed. The ridge did not attack. It drew closer like a noose that did not know if it planned to close. Horses showed paint and sorrel and black. Riders in lines that made the marshal's neat heart unhappy. They did not charge. They watched with the patience of stone. Men on the porch breathed small. The doctor stood in his doorway and did not move because he had used all his courage on other days and had none to spare. The telegraph key clicked without conviction and stopped. Reeves licked a thumb and smoothed his vest and turned his mouth into a law. He said, "Hail when your hour quits. I take the man. I don't care if Dawn or God himself stands behind your shoulder." Mason said, "Then you will have to care about who stands in front of mine." The warrior slept with his eyes a little open, because that is how men sleep when they have learned not to trust silence. Mason wrapped the red wool again and tucked a fold under the man's arm. He said to the little girl, You did the best work already. Go hold your mother's apron and don't run unless she runs." The girl nodded and set the corner of blanket down like it was a ceremony. Outside the ridge thickened until it was not a ridge anymore. It was 200 riders fanned across the slope and down into the flats. The ground felt their hooves before eyes could count them. A line of dust rose like a wall. Naya Saltwind rode out in front wearing a blue calico dress under a man's coat and a beaded strip on her braid that caught sun. She did not shout or wave or show a rifle. She stopped 20 paces from the pump where the blanket first touched dust and looked at Mason and then at the girl. Her face held the weight of command without asking for a witness. She said in English that had been wetted by months in trading posts, "Your child put a blanket on my brother. That calls riders. We came to see if the blanket is a trick or a true thing." She said, "The man your marshal wants is Keita of the Saltwater clan. He lifted my father's horse last year and brought it back with its shoes reset. He is a thief and a healer. He bleeds when he is wrong like the rest of us." Marshal Reeves walked out like a man going to his own wedding. He said, "This town is under American law and you will leave now." He tucked his hands behind his back so no one saw them shake. Naya did not look at him. She looked at the girl Eam and then at Ella, and then at Mason. She said to Ella, "The small one has a name like a bird." "Keep her near," she said to Mason. "You put your hands on my brother and did not finish him. That is already a line drawn in sand. We will watch where your feet go next. We do not cut men for holding blankets, but we do find out who measures mercy by convenience." Pressure from his own side arrived with salt on its tongue. 3 ranchers from the dry quarter and the town banker and a preacher with a collar too tight stood behind Reeves. The banker said, "If you let them form up on our road, you might as well hand them the title to my vault." The rancher with the scar said, "My colt spooked and my boy near broke his neck." "I say we drive them off now while they are busy counting our women," the preacher said. "Mercy is for order, not chaos. Give the marshal the criminal and tell the rest to ride." Their words stacked like lumber behind Reeves and made him taller. Reeves said, "Hail, deliver the man, or be arrested for aiding hostiles." He raised his chin and waited for the town to nod, because the town liked to nod when a man with a star shortened its choices. Mason said, "The warrior is not leaving until I know he will not die on my street. Because your deputy wants to prove his rifle is a loud friend," Reeves said. "Do you confess to siding with hostiles then? Say it." Mason looked at him, who was trying to stand still like a grown woman, and at Ella, whose pistol had vanished into the apron fold but had not gotten far. He said, "I confess to siding with the blanket. My smithy floor is red, and I will not spend the rest of my years hearing the way this hour could have gone colder." The rancher with the scar took a step like he was packing rope, and the Comanche line breathed in one big tide and breathed out again. Not a charge, a reminder. Naya lifted her hand, and a boy no older than 16 walked from their line with a willow hoop. He set it on the ground in front of the pump and stepped back. Naya said, "We test a new friend by whether he will step into the circle when both sides tell him not to. We watch his door, we watch his fire. We watch the way he speaks when he thinks only his walls hear him. You will be watched, Mason Hale, for days, not minutes. Your bread will be counted, your water will be seen. Your people will tell on you without meaning to," Ella said to Naya, with a voice that respected the math. "We will watch back, and you will understand that the child did not ask the marshal first. She gave and then thought, that is what a frontier does when it is still alive. The marshal set limits, sundown for custody, $50 fine for unlawful harboring, and 40 more for speaking like a man who could dole out grace without a license. He tapped his ledger and wrote as if writing made it all true. The banker smiled, and the preacher frowned like he had swallowed a hot coin. Naya said in Comanche to her riders, and some of the town heard it like it was thunder with manners. She said, "Hold the line, hold the horses, hold the boys." She rode forward 3 paces and sat still. The earth stopped pretending it did not care. The 200 riders became a fence the town could understand. Mason stepped into the willow hoop like a man who had been dared by his own lungs. Reeves said, "That is not the law you know." Mason said, "I know. That is why I am standing where the other law looks at me too." He turned to Naya and said, "I cannot promise you anything grand. I can promise you my floor stays open until his breath is honest, and I will walk him to your line, and I will walk him to their line, and I will not turn that walk into a show to feed the worst parts of either side." Naya's mouth did not move, and her eyes softened a shade. No one saw but the ridge and Ella, the hours pressed like a boot to the chest. Mason fed the warrior a mouthful of water, and a sliver of bread softened in broth. Keita breathed better, and then worse, and then better again, exactly the kind of story a town hates because it refuses to jump to its own end. Children were sent inside and came back to windows and were caught again. Im slipped once and almost ran to the ridge because children recognize gratitude like they recognize wolves. But Ella caught her dress and said, "Stay. We honor and still we stay." Em nodded and squeezed the blanket edge and whispered, "Find him when the wind cools." The marshal sent for 2 more deputies and a writ that would make everyone feel official. The banker sent for coffee and the preacher sent for words that would help when words failed. The ridge sent for salt and water and a man with medicine. The doctor finally came with his bag and looked at Keita and at the red wool wrapped around him and at Mason's hands and said, "I will do what I can, and if anyone pulls me off this work they will spend winter with a broken axle." He dug 2 fingers into the wound and did the job that needed doing while the town pretended not to hear. Keita did not cry. Naya watched without blinking. Her jaw changed its set like iron cooling right. The test grew heavier from his own side before it eased from hers. 4 men from the fort rode in with a paper that had a larger seal. They dismounted like the ground paid them to, a sergeant said by order of Colonel Tibbets. "The Indian prisoner will be remanded to military custody forthwith," he said forthwith like he had practiced. Reeves smiled with relief because someone else's seal could share his blame. The sergeant looked at 200 riders and recalculated forthwith to mean after a conversation. He said to Mason, "You will not obstruct. That is treason if your mouth likes big words." Mason said, "I will not obstruct a man being carried by the people who care if he wakes. Where is your doctor?" The sergeant looked at the doctor already busy and said, "Our surgeon is 6 miles and a kindness away," Naya said through the quiet. "Then you will wait and learn a new word. With us." Before sundown, the ridge left 3 gifts near the smithy: a bundle of sage tied with red thread, a bone bead carved with a small spiral, and a thin strip of polished horn. Ella picked up the sage and smelled it. She said, "This is for smoke and not for eating." Em took the bead and turned it until the spiral stopped looking like a design and started looking like a road. Mason ran the horn strip between 2 fingers and felt how smooth something can get when hands do work over and over again. He tied the strip through the blanket edge where it had torn. Naya watched that small repair and the air around her change temperature. She said the girl's blanket is now 2 families long. If you were Mason with a small town at your back and 200 riders at your front and a child's gift bound up in both, would you hand over the wounded man to buy peace, or would you stand under both sets of eyes and call it a life you could sleep in? And if holding your nerve through stories like this feeds your spine, subscribe and keep riding with us because each trail tests different parts of the same heart. Sundown came with brass in its mouth. The marshal stood at the edge of the circle and said, "Time." The sergeant tucked his paper away like a mistake he did not want to repeat out loud. Naya dismounted and walked the 20 paces to the smithy door and stopped at the sill. "Because even in a test you mind thresholds," she said. "Mason Hale. Bring my brother. If he stands, he stands. If he cannot, he does not. But he is carried by hands that mean him to live, not by hands that mean to be right." Mason nodded and lifted. The doctor and the sergeant took an elbow each, and the deputy did not touch, because his pride had learned a new limit. Keita's boots found earth and then almost left it. His legs were the kind that remember dust and still forget it when the body is low on blood. He leaned on Mason and looked up once at the sky, as if it had changed languages while he slept. Naya put her hand under his and steadied without making a show. They walked toward the circle and stopped. Reeves stepped close like a man who meant to snatch a ribbon from a girl and call it justice. His hand brushed the red wool and the town held breath, because touching the blanket without being asked felt like touching a promise with dirty fingers. Mason moved between the blanket and the marshal and did the opening act again with a new meaning. He took the blanket edge and lifted it over his own shoulders and over Keita's, so both stood inside. He said, "This cloth carries a child's breath and a town's choice. Anyone who tears it to get what he wants will hang his own name under the wind longer than I will." Naya said, "Carry him to our line and leave the blanket with me." The girl gave it. "We return it when breath is safe," Reeves said. "I do not recognize blanket law." The sergeant said, "I do today because my surgeon is still 6 miles, and I am not walking back with regret." Warning shots cracked to dust at both flanks because nervous men obeyed their nerves. Dirt jumped and fell. Muzzles came down again because more men obeyed their training. Naya lifted her palm and the ridge breathed once together, a sound like a single horse exhaling. The marshal swallowed a word he had meant to say because it tasted like old copper. Mason and the doctor and the sergeant and Naya carried Keita the last 10 paces. The Comanche line opened and took him with hands that had tied horses and held babies and cleaned weapons, varied and sure. Naya folded the blanket and held it to her mouth once, as if smelling smoke on a winter coat. She turned and walked back without haste. In front of everyone she set the blanket in M's arms and placed the horn strip back through the torn edge. She said to the girl in careful English, "You made a road between camps with this. We ride such roads only when we must." "Thank you." M stood as tall as her bones knew how and returned, "Thank you," like a prayer that did not need a church. Ella put a hand on her daughter's head without pressing down. Mason let breath out and it came back to him. Honest, the marshal looked from blanket to ridge to the sergeant and found his edges had been rounded for him by the day. The preacher did a small thing right. He carried a bucket to the Comanche line and held it out without speech. A young man took it and drank and passed it to an uncle, and then to a woman who wore a man's coat like Naya's, and laughed once without showing teeth. The banker did nothing that hurt, which was his best act this week. The rancher with the scar said to the captain of his own anger, "Go rest," and the captain listened better than usual. The telegraph started again and sent a message to the fort that was shorter than the marshal liked and truer than the banker preferred. Night came without knives. Naya and 10 riders remained center while the rest drifted to the ridge. Firelight tapped along the slope like slow lightning. Keita slept under the hands of a man with medicine and under the eyes of the 12 most stubborn elders in any direction. Soldiers bedded down on the dry grass with their boots on. The town closed shutters and did not close ears. M slept on the blanket on the floor and snored once like a colt. Ella sat in a chair and watched the door. Mason sharpened tools slower than necessary because the sound kept his hands calm. Naya sat on the sill with her elbows on her knees and listened to the cicadas grade the dark. Morning walked in with the doctor's hat crooked and a grin under it. He said the man will live if he wants to. And I have seen that look in the eyes of mule teams that refuse to die at the bottom of a hill. He said he will carry his arm higher than pride for a while and then lower than habit forever. Naya nodded once in a way that made a whole year move. She stood and faced Reeves and the sergeant and Mason and Ella at once. She said, "Our watching does not end. Not because we are looking for revenge, because we are measuring if the blanket was a single breath or the start of a way of breathing." Mason said, "Come taste our bread on days when hooves do not speak." The offer was small and dangerous and new. The fort men left with their paper unchanged and their heads changed by 1 degree. Reeves found errands that did not pass the smithy door, and he did them well because shame is a muscle that gets sore and then either grows or hardens. The banker counted slower and charged exactly the same, which was not worse than yesterday. The preacher prayed for clarity and then tried to sound like he got some. Children counted riders from the ridge once a day and stopped when the number stayed under 10, which meant life could continue without new rules. The doctor slept in the pew at the back of the church and no one woke him. The double test came quiet and in daylight. Like all honest trials, Naya asked Mason to stand before 5 elders and 2 hot-shouldered young men under a cottonwood near the creek. She asked him to tell them what he would do next time a wounded man fell in his dust. He said, "I will do the same and faster, and if the man wears blue or red or beads or a Bible on his chest, I will still do it. A boy with a braid to his belt spat to one side and said, "You will do it for us because you fear our horses." Mason said, "I fear what my child hears in my voice if I change the price of mercy for anyone." The elders breathed like leaves and nodded like rocks. On his side, the town called an evening meeting under the courthouse eave. Reeves spoke of law and order and rites of passage and not losing face. Mason said, "I do not plan to lose my face. I plan to keep it when my girl grows and asks why I let a good thing die in daylight and called it order." The rancher with the scar stood and said, "I saw the child and the blanket before I saw the man on the ground. Shame on me." The banker coughed and said, "Shame is not a ledger item, and yet it adds up." The preacher said, "I am tired of burying the fruit of our quick mouths." There was no vote. There was bread broken and news spread, and that counted more. A few weeks later, Keita rode into town under his own weight, thin with healing but taller for it. He wore his hair clubbed with a leather tie and his arm bound in clean cloth. He dismounted at the pump and touched his forehead and chest and the pump handle like they were kin. He walked to him with his hands open and gave her a new blanket, blue with 2 red bands and no torn edge. He said in Comanche and then in English that Naya taught him, "I pay my debt and keep the old one." He nodded at the red wool folded at her elbow, and she nodded back like a woman too young to vote and old enough to understand treaties. The last test came without warning, and with every chance to fail, 3 drifters who liked other men's cattle and the smoke of other men's fires took the quiet for weakness and rode straight at the pump with their mouths loud. They grabbed for the blue blanket and for M's thin arm, and for an hour of attention, Mason stepped and Naya moved at the same breath. Her hand went to his shoulder, and his hand went to her waist, and they used each other like leverage and not like a crutch. Warning shots cracked to dust close enough to throw grit on boots and not close enough to make second thoughts. The drifters found themselves on the ground looking up at 2 lines, one of men who had decided not to hang any more of their neighbors by mistake, one of riders who had decided not to watch another child get frightened for sport. Naya stood over the closest drifter, with her boot near his wrist and her voice kinder than he deserved. She said, "Pick a different town with a different sky." He chose to. He got on his horse with both hands, showing and left, and his friends found the same genius. M held the blue blanket like a person holds a promise and said, "Can we keep both?" Naya said yes. Mason said yes. Reeves said nothing because sometimes silence is the truest part of a confession. The ridgeline relaxed without losing its shape. The town exhaled and tasted dust and liked it, because it meant men were still standing, on the last day of October when the air was thin as glass. Naya and Mason stood in the same 30 yards and looked at the same pump and the same rail and a different sky. They had been watched and had watched back. They had failed at smaller things and mended them, and had not failed at the one that would have ruined a child. Ella stood with them between them, and the blankets folded between both arms. Mason said, "I have no ring. I have a shop and a door and a yard that does not shut to our neighbors when they bleed." Naya said, "I have a camp that will not shame me for sharing bread with a man who keeps his hand steady when a law shakes." Ella said, "Say what you mean." He said, "Stay." She said, "I will stay and ride and teach and argue and hold." At the pump, they tied 2 strips of cloth together, one blue, one red, and let the wind study the knot. What this cost and what it bought lived mostly inside them and only showed in the way Mason set tools exactly where they belonged. And in the way Naya listened to fools with enough patience to keep them from being dangerous. Courage had not sounded like shouting. Mercy had not been free. Peace had demanded that both sides spend from their pride until it could not afford another war. If that sits right in your chest and you want the next hard trail with the same honest weight, settle by our fire, subscribe, and help us keep telling these Western hearts so the daylight keeps finding its work.